President Vladimir Putin will hold talks with US envoy Steve Witkoff on Tuesday as part of efforts to reach a peace deal with Ukraine. That prospective meeting in Moscow follows negotiations between US and Ukrainian officials in Florida on Sunday. US Secretary of State Marco Rubio described the talks as productive, but said more work needs to be done. Substantial changes have been made to an earlier 28-point plan, which was widely seen as too favorable to Russia. Rubio stressed the aim of achieving lasting peace and to help rebuild Ukraine.
Our goal here is to end the war, but it's more than just to end the war. We don't just want to end the war, we also want to help Ukraine be safe forever, so never again will they face another invasion, and equally importantly, we want them to enter an age of true prosperity. We want the Ukrainian people to emerge from this war, not just to rebuild their country, but to build it back in a way that will be stronger and more prosperous than it's ever been. And so this is comprehensive, what we're working on here today. It's not just about the terms that ends fighting. It's about also the terms that set up Ukraine for long-term prosperity. I thought we started laying the groundwork for that, most certainly in Geneva. I think we continued that work in our communications throughout the week. I think we built on that again today, but there's more work to be done. This is delicate, it's complicated, there are a lot of moving parts, and obviously there's another party involved here that'll have to be a part of the equation, and that'll continue later this week when Mr. Witkoff travels to Moscow.
Now let's bring in Ivana Stradner. She is a research fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies Russia program and joins us now. Ivana, the Florida talks have been called productive. Were there any key concessions made from the original 28-point plan?
I think it's too early to speculate anything, but based on Mr. Rubio's remarks, where he's talking that, ending the war itself is not enough, that it's very important to think in the long term, to talk about, prosperity in Ukraine, that Ukraine is safe for a very long time. It tells me all I really need to know, that the 28-point plan that was originally discussed is not anymore in talks. Actually, I do believe that all those remarks related to territory concessions will not work. I also think that the United States will revisit the whole concept about Ukraine joining NATO, and there might be, some disagreements on putting the limits on the Ukrainian military. But as I said, I think it's very important not to make any speculations right now, but only to do analysis based on what we know right now. And but the most important thing will be this week, further discussions in Moscow.
Now, US sources say that 9 points were cut post-Geneva. What does that mean for the amnesty clause, for example, or NATO restrictions?
As I said, I think it's very important to wait for the final document, but Washington absolutely understands that the 28-point plan will not work with Ukraine, and that's absolutely ridiculous to push for that, because Ukraine will not agree on surrendering territory that is not even occupied, by Russia. Ukraine is not willing to give up its NATO, joining NATO, but also the EU. So that, plan is not going to work. I think what's very important right now to focus on is how to provide Ukraine with security guarantees, but not only that are just strong in words. We really have to make sure once it happens that Putin will try to cross our red lines, and whether we'll be willing to follow through on that.
Now, Trump has praised Kushner and Rubio's teamwork, but Zelenskyy turns to Europe now. Is Washington losing Ukraine's trust?
So you're absolutely right that President Trump has praised this particular, meeting, as he's thinking, that things are moving in the direction. I don't think that Washington is going to abandon Ukraine. There are a lot of things that President Trump is saying, but I think it's very important to focus also on what he's doing. And our center of gravity is our alliances, and that's why it's precisely very important that Europe and the United States work together together. I think, that it's very important for Zelenskyy to meet with European officials, including Macron, because Europe, especially Germany, France, and the UK, should take the lead there when it comes to security guarantees and when it comes to protection of Ukraine. But here is the thing. One thing that President Trump does not understand fully is that Russia is already at war with the West. Think about this. What's happening with sabotage activities across Europe, whether cutting sea cables, whether drone incursion, this is a new generation of warfare. And right now, both Germany and France and the UK understand perfectly this, and that's precisely why they are trying to sort this thing out. Unfortunately, the United States is stretched out to so many different areas, what's happening in the Middle East, China threat, what's happening right now in Venezuela. So we really have to also be focused and to understand here in Washington that Russia's aggressive war in Ukraine, it's not only against Ukraine, it's truly against the West and the United States as well, because Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea are working together to undermine the West. And the sooner Washington understands this, the better.
Now, you've mentioned that one needs to differentiate between what Trump says and what he does. Now, if Moscow rejects tweaks, will Trump use sanctions or let Putin dictate terms again?
I have to admit, it's not if Russia rejects. I am quite certain that Putin will reject. And because Putin is the one who believes that he can ask all those maximalist demands. And that's why he precisely was pushing for that 28-point agreement. So actually, he wanted Zelenskyy to reject this, so portray Zelenskyy as an unreliable partner. And I think this is going to be a huge test for the United States and Europe. I think President Trump should pursue further sanctions and should send a very, very clear message to Moscow that if Putin doesn't stop this war, that our long-range missiles will be on the horizon to provide Ukraine, so Russia will be on the defensive.
Thank you very much. Ivana Stradner there, a research fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Thank you.
Thank you.
Meanwhile, in Paris, Ukraine's Vladimir Zelenskyy has met with his French counterpart, Emmanuel Macron, to shore up European support. Macron's office said the leaders will discuss what it called the conditions of a just and durable peace. This is Zelenskyy's second visit to Paris in recent weeks. Well, for more, let's bring in our Paris correspondent, Lisa Lewis. Lisa, this is Zelenskyy's second visit within 2 weeks, with the aim to move negotiations forward. Remind us, what role does France really play here?
President Emmanuel Macron is very much at the forefront of this European show of support for Ukraine. This is actually the 10th visit by President Zelenskyy since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. The Europeans want to show that they stand united with Ukraine. That country has long since turned into Europe's front, the front line in this war with Russia, especially as a number of European countries have been hit by so-called hybrid attacks, airspace violations, incidents with drones, but also cyber attacks. And that's why a number of European countries have put in place, again, military service, such as France last week that announced a voluntary military service destined to gear up the ranks of its military personnel by tens of thousands of soldiers over the next decade.
Now, how does France and, by extension, the EU how do they position themselves to stay relevant in this peace process?
Well, that's a very good question. It's very difficult for the Europeans to stay relevant. They know that Russia very much wants to talk to only the US directly and sideline Europe and even Ukraine. But they have been managing to keep the conversation going, to get into those closed doors with some kind of successor. When you look at the current peace plan that is on the table, in its initial version, for example, there was no talks of any, NATO troops in, or there was actually a ban on NATO troops in Ukraine, and now that has turned into some kind of Western troops that shouldn't be stationed there in the long run. So somehow the European Union is getting a place at the table, even if it's very difficult to maintain that place.
Now, France wants a central role in delivering security guarantees to Ukraine. How do they propose to do that?
France is also spearheading the so-called coalition of the willing together with the UK, and that coalition of the willing, a number of countries, including countries from the EU but also outside the EU, have come up with a plan to station tens of thousands of soldiers in Ukraine in the long run once there is a peace plan in place. These soldiers wouldn't be on the front line directly. They would be function somehow as peace troops further back in the country, but they would be there to reassure some kind of peace and also intervene if attacked. And that is how they're trying to get some kind of plan on the road and also stay relevant in these peace talks.
Our correspondent Lisa Louis there in Paris. Thank you, Lisa. Now, let's cross over to Marina Miron, military analyst at Defence Studies Department at King's College in London. Marina, first off, while all these negotiations and talks are going on, what's the situation on the front line in Ukraine right now?
Good morning, Gerhard. The situation continues to be complicated for the Ukrainian armed forces. We have been talking about Pokrovsk and Mironograd the past weeks, and now the situation is shifting. The attention is shifting to the Zaporizhia region, where the Russian forces have entered a settlement called Gulay-Pole, which they tried to take back in 2022, but the Ukrainian forces were able to push the Russians away from the settlement. The problem with that settlement is that it's important for Ukrainian logistics to supply the troops in the south. And of course, if the Russians manage to take Gulay-Pole and Orikhiv, they will be able to push the Ukrainian forces westward to Dnipro. So again, it's one of those fortifications that the Ukrainian forces have been using and which could create a gap in Ukrainian defenses. And of course, we have activities in other sectors such as Kupiansk, not so much, Seversk as well, and some activity, Russian attacks around Sloviansk as well.
Now, as we've seen, Zelensky's in Paris today, but also EU defense ministers are meeting in Brussels to discuss the Russian threat. What should Europe do now to help Ukraine and themselves?
I guess that's a billion-dollar question right there, because the situation for Europe and specifically for European NATO members is very complicated, because they realize that Europe itself needs US support. Full US NATO participation, so to say, because more than 50% of military capabilities are coming from the United States. At the same time, the Europeans are facing, quote unquote, the hybrid threat from the Russians in form of cyber attacks, drones, and sabotage. So there are calls to adopt a harsher stance, especially in the cybersecurity realm. So there will be changes within the European defense architecture in order to be able to face those threats and to be more resilient and perhaps proactive, which requires time and money. And at the same time, the Europeans are trying to win a seat at the table when it comes to negotiating a just peace for Ukraine. Whether they have enough political leverage and capabilities, that is another question. And so there are many things that need to be considered, but it's a very complicated situation for the Europeans here.
You mentioned capabilities there. The Netherlands, for example, just pledged $290 million to buy weapons for Ukraine. And Macron lately promised a significant number of fighter jets to Ukraine. But Let's take the fighter jets. How can they change a war of drones and missiles?
First, we have to understand the fighter jet question. President Zelenskyy has met President Macron, and indeed, as such, a bilateral agreement has been discussed. But there is no timeline because realistically, those fighter jets would need to be produced before they are being sold to Ukraine. In other words, yes, fighter jets can enhance Ukrainian security, especially in the air domain. But the problem here lies in the fact that first, it's unclear what budget will be allocated to purchasing them. So who's going to pay for them? And when are they going to arrive in Ukraine? And the same goes for the Swedish Gripen. When are they going to arrive in Ukraine? In what numbers? So if it's trickled down over the next 10, 15 years, then it doesn't really make a difference. And that is a problem.
Military analyst Marina Miron there. Thank you very much, Marina.
Thank you for having me.
I'd like to welcome Eliot A. Cohen now, a defence and security expert and Professor Emeritus at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Welcome to DW. Now, you've written in The Atlantic this week quite an interesting article. I want to paraphrase part of it for our audience. You've written there are two ways to interpret this Trump peace initiative in Ukraine. You say that some claim it's greed, stupidity, an urge to betray Ukraine, an authoritarian lust for intimacy with Russia, or something altogether more complicated. What's the more complicated way you're seeing this?
Well, the more complicated doesn't necessarily mean nice. And for sure, there are people in the administration, I would include Steve Witkoff, particularly among them, who don't particularly care at all about Ukraine and do have some of those motivations that I described. I think Trump's motivations are a little bit more complicated. I think he wants to see himself as a peacemaker. And I think Rubio, who's playing a very large role in the negotiations, is actually somebody who has fairly traditional, I would say, traditional Republican views of this war, and as you could tell from his comments, is actually quite pro-Ukraine. But one has to emphasize, this is a very unstable administration. You can't be quite sure what they're going to do from one moment to another. But I think the point of the article was really to say it's a mistake to think that this is simply the Trump administration doing its best to betray Ukraine. That could happen, but I don't think that's what's on offer at the moment.
Why do you say, though, that the Trump administration has an urge to betray Ukraine? What is this urge?
Well, I don't say that it does. I think there's some... Look, I think Trump does not particularly care for Zelenskyy. And I'm not sure that he particularly cares about Ukraine. I think he cares about his relationship with Putin. I think there's a kind of a financial side to it. Above all, I think he cares about his reputation as a peacemaker. The point is, this administration, even more than most, is divided. And I think it's also very important to bear in mind what the administration has actually done. It's continuing to share intelligence with Ukraine. It's allowing European states to buy very advanced American weaponry to give to Ukraine. So it's a messier picture than one might at first think. Right.
And as you say, Trump supporters would argue that he has helped broker deals for European nations to provide Ukraine with more weapons, it's provided intelligence, and that he is the one, I presume his supporters would say, that's gotten Russia and Ukraine possibly close to a peace breakthrough. What's your response to that?
Well, I think, one also has to add the oil sanctions, particularly on Lukoil and Rosneft, that the Trump administration imposed, which have had an effect and which the Biden administration did not. Look, I think the most important thing for everybody to remember is this may end up as a ceasefire, but it's not the end of the war. I don't think there's any way that Vladimir Putin is going to give up his ambition to reduce Ukraine to a satellite, if not to absorb it entirely. But it could be a very useful ceasefire. It could be a ceasefire that lasts. It just everybody has to walk into this with their eyes open. This won't be over if there's some sort of agreement. That said, there's a reason for both sides to come to some kind of agreement right now when the lines are not moving on the front, when both sides are exhausted. So you can understand why people would think there's room for a ceasefire now.
We've been speaking to Eliot A. Cohen. He's a Professor Emeritus at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Thank you so much for your time, Professor.
You're very welcome.